You just parked on my grandfather's lawn. Again, you think just because you've got a badge and a clipboard that grass doesn't mean anything? I said it without yelling, calm, too calm maybe. But that's how you speak when someone keeps stepping on the one thing you swore to protect. Hey, I'm Cole Mercer. I'm a shop teacher, a quiet guy most days, but I've had enough of people like Janice Whitcomb thinking the world is theirs to rearrange. Before we get into the mess that turned my front yard into a battlefield, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because by the time this is over, you're going to see how I turned a lawn into the sharpest message our HOA ever got. Now let me tell you why this fight wasn't just about grass. My granddad, Walter Mercer, planted that front lawn one blade at a time back in 1964, after coming home from the war and buying this house with every penny he saved working nights at the mill. I used to sit with him under the old pecan tree in the center of that lawn, listening to stories about honor, about doing things the right way. Even when no one was watching, he kept a folded map in the shed, his own drawing of the lot boundaries and plantings. "We don't own the earth, Cole," he told me once, handing me that map. "We just care for our corner of it. That tree's still there, so's the shed, and so was the grass, until Janice's silver Lexus left 2 muddy arcs across it last Thursday. It wasn't an accident. That's the part that got me. Our HOA, ironically named Prosper Meadows, scheduled an unannounced property inspection. She didn't want to park down the road like everyone else, said she had somewhere to be, and just rolled up over my curb like it was a welcome mat. The first time, I let it go. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she thought it was harmless. The second time, I asked her to park elsewhere. Her exact words? "Cole, we all make sacrifices for the community. You have more grass than anyone else. It's just a patch." A patch? That patch is where I scattered my grandfather's ashes 5 years ago. I didn't say that. Not then. You learn not to offer meaning to people who treat everything like a utility. I just nodded and watched the tire tracks smear over the spot right beneath the pecan's shadow. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, it's gotten worse. Janice now uses my lawn as her personal pullovers lane whenever she swings by to drop off warning letters, like the one about my visibly leaning mailbox, which hasn't leaned a day in its life. She sent HOA board members, 2 smug guys named Brian and Gary, to photograph the perimeter, citing some nonsense about unclean landscaping edges. And every time they come, their tires edge a little further onto the lawn. Last night, I sat on the porch with a coffee and stared at the ruts left behind. My boots itched to stomp something, but instead I reached for my grandfather's map. Still folded, still accurate. A line traced in blue pen showed exactly where the easement ends and my land begins. And those ruts, they weren't on the border. They were deep inside the line. Funny thing about men like my grandfather. He didn't believe in shouting. He believed in quiet, steady consequences. You break a rule, you earn a reminder. You do it again, you find out why the rule mattered in the first place. So I decided, if they're going to ignore boundaries, maybe they need to feel them. But that's a story for later. For now, all you need to know is this. I'm not letting my grandfather's legacy get trampled by a smug HOA president and her self-righteous clipboard crew. They want to test limits, they're about to learn mine have teeth. And it all started with a tire, a patch of grass, and a tree that remembers more than they ever will. That morning, I was out early with a rake, smoothing the fresh gouges her tires left behind, like I was dressing a wound. The sun was still low enough to cast the pecan tree's shadow across the yard, and I remember thinking, this isn't about grass. It never was. By 8, I heard the familiar squeal of brakes, Janice's Lexus, silver and smug as always, pulling into the street like she owned it. This time she stayed on the road, maybe because I was already outside, rake in hand, looking right at her. She stepped out like she was stepping onto a red carpet, heels clicking, sunglasses oversized, clipboard already tucked under one arm. "Morning, Cole," she chirped. "Got your 3rd notice here. Seems your mailbox still isn't in compliance." "My mailbox has never moved," I said, not even bothering to look up, "unlike your tires." Janice smiled, that slow, insincere kind. "You're making this personal. That's not what the HOA is about." No, of course not. To her it was about standards, a sanitized way to dress up control. And people like Janice? They weaponize rules the way some folks use knives, silent, sharp, and always with a smile. I'm requesting a hearing, I told her. On the parking. She laughed, actually laughed. A hearing? Over a lawn? Cole, I've seen kids more resilient than that grass of yours. I didn't respond. I just walked over to the edge of the lawn, tapped the boundary marker with the end of my rake, and held her gaze. Her smile faltered, just for a second, then she turned on her heel and walked off, saying over her shoulder, "Be sure to trim those edges by Friday, we're doing another drive-by." I stood there for a while after she left, listening to the wind in the pecan branches. It made a sound like whispering paper. The rake still in my hand, I remembered being a kid raking that very lawn with my grandfather, who used to joke, "Keep it neat, or the squirrels'll think it's theirs." Now it wasn't squirrels, it was people in business blazers who thought lines on a map. That evening I headed over to see Doug, my neighbor 2 houses down. He was in his driveway working on an old pickup that had been in restoration since the Bush administration. He didn't look up when I walked over. "She made that lawsuit up a killing dream?" I asked, already guessing. "Mailbox this time," I said. He snorted, wiped grease off his hands. "She fined me last year for having wind chimes, said they were auditorily intrusive, like I'm running a damn gong show." I leaned against the bed of the truck. "You ever think about pushing back?" Doug paused, then gave a small shrug. "I got a wife who likes living here and a son with 3 more years of school. Janice knows it. She counts on us not having time to care." I didn't reply. Because he wasn't wrong. That was the trick. They exhaust you. Not with war, but with small battles. Paper cuts until you just give up. But I wasn't planning on giving up. Later that night, I was back in my shed, flipping through that folded map again. The edges were curled, ink faded in spots, but it was still legible. A single note in my grandfather's handwriting caught my eye. Next to the edge of the lawn, he'd written, "Reinforced in '88, stakes every 4 feet." I pulled open the floorboard. There, in the crawl space, were 5 rusted metal stakes, each capped in red paint. He had his own boundaries. That stuck with me. And the next day, when I saw Janice's Lexus nose an inch onto the edge of my property again, just enough to avoid blocking the driveway behind her, I didn't say anything. I just went back to the shed and started measuring. I spent the better part of that Saturday morning walking the edge of my lawn with a measuring wheel in one hand and my grandfather's map in the other. Every few feet, I marked a small X in chalk. 10 feet inside the official curb line. Janice liked to blur boundaries. I was about to make them undeniable. Halfway through, I heard slow footsteps behind me. I turned to see Terry Long, the HOA treasurer, standing on the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his beige windbreaker. He was in his 60s, wore the same faded baseball cap no matter the weather, and always had the look of a man permanently stuck in someone else's argument. "You doing a survey, Cole?" he asked, voice quiet. I nodded without looking up, just measuring what's mine. Terry lingered. He always moved like he was afraid of stepping on something that might explode. I waited for him to say more, but he just rocked on his heels and stared at the chalk marks I was making. "I remember your granddad doing something like that back in the day," he finally said. "He didn't trust city records." "Neither do I said. He nodded slowly, lips pursed like he wanted to say more, but his jaw just twitched. His eyes dropped to my chalk marks again, then up to the pecan tree. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Janice ain't got the right to park on this side like she does. Easement only applies 2 feet from curb, been that way since the last amendment. But she bullies the vote every year." That made me pause. "You were there for that vote?" I asked. He shifted his weight, looked toward his shoes. "She railroaded it through. Most of us didn't even get a say. He stopped himself, then gave a tight nod toward the house. "Look, I've got boxes in the garage, old records. I'll see what I can find." Before I could ask anything else, he was already walking away, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy that didn't belong to him. I stood there a long time, watching him disappear down the block. The chalk felt heavier in my hand. Later that afternoon, I started digging, literally. At each chalk X, I used a small hand trowel to punch a hole 6 inches deep, lining it with a layer of gravel and setting in short PVC tubes. I capped them for now, just prep work, just groundwork. No one noticed. Janice was probably off ruining someone else's roses. But Sunday morning, that changed. I came outside to find a bright orange HOA notice nailed to my mailbox post. The paper flapped in the breeze like a warning flag. Authorized excavation. Potential violation of common property standards. I didn't yell. I didn't storm off. I just walked to the curb and sat on the bottom step, holding the notice between two fingers. Then I smiled. Because if Janice was reacting, it meant she was watching, and if she was watching, she was worried. That afternoon, I drove down to the hardware store and bought a dozen pressure sensors. Cheap ones meant for driveway alarms and a handful of solar lights. Not for the lawn, for visibility, the kind that make people second guess where they step. On my way back, I saw Terry again, this time across the street, talking to Doug. He saw me, then quickly looked away. His hand fidgeted with the brim of his cap. Doug nodded once in my direction, then turned back to his truck like nothing happened. That night, I installed the sensors and lights in the tubes. I didn't set them live yet, not yet. Sometimes, you don't need a trap to spring, you just need them to know one's there. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had noticed the lights. Subtle, nothing flashy, just small solar markers along the edge of the lawn, evenly spaced, softly glowing like a runway for common sense. Janice didn't knock this time. She didn't need to. The envelope was already taped to my front door when I stepped outside, printed in bold red font. Formal HOA warning, unauthorized landscape modification without board approval. I didn't even bother reading the rest. It was another scare tactic, a paper cut meant to bleed time and energy. But I'd stopped bleeding. I tucked the letter into my jacket and walked to the edge of the yard. The sensors weren't even activated yet, but neighbors were already steering clear, giving my grass a suspicious side eye, like it might bite. Doug ambled over mid-morning with a coffee and his usual slouched gait. He took one look at the solar lights, then whistled low. "Looks like you're building a runway," he said, smirking. "Just trying to keep things visible," I replied. "Wouldn't want anyone to accidentally trespass." Doug chuckled but didn't push further. He leaned on the fence post and sipped. "Terry came by last night. Said Janice was blowing a fuse over the sensor installation. Thinks you're rigging landmines." "Close," I said, deadpanned. He barked a laugh. "You know, I always thought you were the quiet type. Didn't peg you for the chessboard kind." "Quiet doesn't mean passive," I said. Doug nodded slowly, then his voice lowered. "Just watch yourself. She's got pull, and she doesn't like being made a fool of." "Then maybe she should stop acting like one," I said, and turned back to the lawn. By late afternoon, the HOA truck rolled through the block like a patrol vehicle. Janice wasn't driving. It was Brian this time, the younger of her two lapdogs. He wore mirrored sunglasses and parked right across from my house, engine idling like he was waiting for a drug deal. I stayed on my porch, not moving, watching him the way my granddad used to watch squirrels from that same spot, curious but with a loaded slingshot under the cushion. Brian eventually stepped out and snapped 3 photos of the lawn. Front, left, right, then got back in and drove off. No words exchanged, no notices handed out, just surveillance. The funny part? That felt like a win. Later that evening, I was in the shed sorting through old tools when I came across a small, rusted tin my grandfather used to keep matchbooks in. Inside was a folded slip of paper labeled HOA 1988. It was a hand-scribbled list of incident dates, grievances, and board vote results. One note read, "Board tried expanding curb easement, voted down 3-2. Whitcomb family abstained." Whitcomb. It hit me like a cold gust. Janice's maiden name must have been Whitcomb. That meant her family had been trying to pull this stunt for decades, and now she was just continuing their legacy of control. I brought the paper into the house, scanned it, and saved it on a flash drive. The lights outside glowed soft through the blinds, quite sentinels on watch. The next morning, I installed a motion-triggered camera in the front window, angled right at the lawn. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't even that high-tech, but it recorded sound, and that's what mattered. By now, even the mailman was cutting a wider path around the grass. That same day, Terry showed up again. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk, fiddling with a small folder in his hand. "I looked through the boxes," he said quietly. "I found minutes from 2011. Janice's mother tried to rewrite the lawn ordinances, got shut down hard, but Janice rewrote them herself in 2019, claimed it was a reprint for clarity." Did she file it legally? I asked. He shook his head. Doesn't look like it, but most folks don't read the filings close enough to care. I looked him square in the eye. I do. Terry's lips tightened. His knuckles were white around the folder, but he handed it over. I never agreed with this. I just didn't want a target on my back. You've still got time to aim at the right one, I said. He gave a small nod, eyes flicking to the solar lights. Then he walked away, slower this time but straighter than before. The folder Terry gave me was thin, but every page inside crackled with quiet rebellion. Tucked between two HOA meeting summaries was a faded memo signed by Janice's mother, Eleanor Whitcomb. The name hit harder now that I knew it wasn't just Janice being petty. This was generational. A dynasty of self-appointed rule-makers. At the bottom of one page was a scribbled note. The original bylaws, Walter Mercer archive copy. Walter Mercer, my grandfather. That night, I stood at the top of the basement stairs for a moment before going down. I hadn't been down there in years, not since the water heater burst in 16. The pull chain light buzzed and blinked as I made my way down, boots creaking on the old wood steps. Damp, cool air clung to the walls, the kind that smells like forgotten years. I ran my hand along the back shelf, past dusty paint cans and stacked lawn chair frames. Nothing but junk. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the far corner, behind the workbench. And that's when I saw it. A tall, dented file cabinet, half covered with a moth-eaten tarp. The bottom drawer was rusted shut, but the top three moved with a groan. Inside, hundreds of documents, each bundled in rubber bands. Blueprints, receipts, yard tags from the 1,980. Then I found it. Civic Guidelines, 1973 revision/Mercer copy, scrawled in permanent marker on an old manila folder. I opened it slowly. The paper inside was thick, faded, slightly brittle at the edges. And, right there on the second page, personal lots maintain full boundary ownership from sidewalk inward, with no HOA access or override unless written consent is granted. That clause was missing in the version Janice waved around at meetings. I froze. Not from fear, something colder, the kind of stillness that comes when you realize you've been right and wrong at the same time. Right about her lies, wrong for waiting this long to dig deep enough. A sudden click behind me made me jolt. I spun, flashlight beam cutting through dust. Nothing moved. But the sound came from above, the basement door easing shut. I moved quickly, taking the folder and scanning a few more drawers. A second one held my grandfather's journal entries, not daily reflections, just notes when things mattered. One was labeled, Whitcomb again, claims power over curb, gonna bury the markers deeper this time. That's when I realized the stakes I'd uncovered near the tree weren't just personal boundaries. They were reminders, silent warnings, placed for the next Mercer to find. I took both the journal and the folder upstairs. Back in the kitchen, I laid everything out on the table, turning on the small desk lamp my grandfather used to keep near the door. The glow was warm, steady, unlike the flickering basement light. Fitting. The next morning, I made digital copies of the bylaws and journal entries, saved them to 2 flash drives, one went in my safe, the other stayed in my pocket. At noon, Janice rang the doorbell. First time she'd done that in weeks. I opened the door slowly. She stood there in a salmon blouse and a blazer too stiff for the 80-degree heat. Her tone was sweet enough to rot paint. Cole, I've noticed a rise in tension lately. I'd like to extend an olive branch. Let's schedule a meeting, privately, just us. I met her smile with something sharper. Sure, I said, but let's make sure we both bring the right documents this time. She blinked. That smile twitched. Meaning? Original bylaws, signed copies, not the ones you edited for clarity. Janice stared, expression frozen between confusion and threat. Then her voice flattened. You've been digging. I nodded. And your family's been burying things a long time. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away, heels stiff on the sidewalk, posture too upright for someone who wasn't rattled. And as she disappeared down the block, I looked back through the screen door toward the pecan tree. The lawn wasn't just grass anymore. It was a map, and I was starting to read it, line by line. Janice didn't show up the next day. No calls, no notes, no drive-bys. Just silence, which, coming from her, felt louder than anything. I spent the morning raking the lawn again, not out of habit but purpose. I traced each line of the yard with quiet attention, pausing every so often near the pecan tree. My grandfather's words looped in my mind. We just care for our corner of it. That corner had become a war zone. I pulled the old map back out and walked the lines again. It was more than a sketch, it was a message. Every tree, every planting, even the way the flower bed curved along the driveway, it all followed a pattern. At the base of the pecan, just below the mulch ring, I found it. A small metal plate, half buried, worn down to a dull brass finish. I used a screwdriver to pry it up. Beneath it was a plastic case, watertight military guile. Inside, a sealed envelope, yellowed. My name handwritten on the front in bold black ink. Cole. For when the rules fail. I sat down under the tree and opened it with both hands. It wasn't long, just a page, a letter from my grandfather, dated exactly 1 year before he passed. If you're reading this, then the board's still trying to step over their place. Don't let them. They like to change the words, but land remembers where it belongs. Use the map, use the markers, and if you have to, use the box. I buried it 10 feet west of the shed, under the old toolbox slab. I never needed it. Maybe you won't either. But if they're making it personal, you'll know what to do. My pulse kicked up. Not with fear, with clarity. My grandfather hadn't just drawn lines. He had prepared for this. That afternoon, I got a spade and measured 10 feet west of the shed. The soil was firmer there, rocky, packed. I started digging, each motion slow, deliberate, no rush, just intention. Half an hour in, I hit something solid, concrete. I cleared the edges, brushed off dirt, and uncovered a slab roughly the size of a microwave door. It took another 20 minutes to crack it open. Inside, a long, narrow steel case with latches. It wasn't locked. I opened it gently. Inside were 6 steel spike traps, hand-welded, designed to sit just beneath the grass, narrow enough to avoid detection but strong enough to punch through a tire. My grandfather didn't play games. I sat back, stunned, not by what he'd left, but by how much he believed I'd need it, that he saw this fight coming decades ahead. Didn't touch them yet. Not immediately. I closed the case and reburied it, just deep enough to know it was there. Later that evening, I walked the lawn again, this time with a notebook and the scanned bylaws tucked under one arm. I marked off areas where the spikes could be placed legally, entirely on my property, behind the boundary line. Doug walked over again, arms crossed, watching me. "You look like you're plotting a revolution," he said. "Just tightening the screws," I said. He tilted his head, then nodded at the tree. "You always sit under that thing like it's giving orders." I smiled. "Maybe it is." Doug rubbed the back of his neck. "Terry said Janice hasn't called a board meeting in over a week. That's not like her." "She's thinking," I said. "She knows I'm not bluffing." Doug took a long breath, eyes scanning the lights along the edge of my lawn. "Whatever you're planning, just don't let her turn it into something it's not. She loves to play the victim when she's cornered." I nodded. "That's why I'm staying one step ahead." Before I went in that night, I placed a small brass plaque near the base of the tree. Nothing flashy, just one line carved into the metal. "Boundary kept, legacy honored." And I meant every word. The plaque under the pecan tree was barely visible unless you were looking for it, but I noticed how Terry paused when he walked by the next morning. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, as if he finally understood something he'd been trying to ignore. That same morning, I activated the motion-triggered camera for sound recording. I installed a second one on the porch roof to ensure perfect angles. Angled low, unobtrusive, but wide enough to catch the whole lawn. It was time to stop preparing and start documenting. I wasn't going to tell the board what they were doing wrong anymore. I was going to let them show everyone themselves. At noon, I called a friend of mine from college, Elias Tran. We hadn't talked in years, but I remembered he'd gone into real estate law, the kind that untangled zoning nightmares and could smell fraud from a county away. He picked up on the third ring. "Cole Mercer, either you're finally selling that fixer-upper or you need help hiding a body." "Neither," I said, "but the second one's tempting." I gave him the rundown. Janice, the altered bylaws, the surveillance, the trespassing. I emailed him the original Mercer map, the grandfathered property clause, and the scanned folder I found in the basement. There was a pause. Then he whistled. "You're sitting on a legal landmine. You know that, right?" "That's why I'm calling," I said. He reviewed the files over the next hour and confirmed everything. The amended bylaws Janice distributed weren't properly filed. They weren't notarized. And worse, the original HOA charter hadn't even been officially recorded after their last board reshuffle. "They're bluffing with counterfeit teeth," Elias said. "You could take this to a county review board and they'd dismantle her leadership overnight." I let that settle in. A nuclear option. But I wasn't done stacking the deck. "Terry," I said that evening, catching him just as he returned from walking his dog, "you said Janice pushed a vote through without full consent. You remember which meeting that was?" He shifted. "August 2019. She claimed it was an emergency clause during road repairs." "Would you be willing to say that on record?" His hands tightened around the leash. "I don't know, Cole. I've lived here 22 years. I don't want to be the guy that burns the neighborhood down." I stepped forward. "You won't be. You'll be the guy who saved it from someone who already lit the match." Terry looked at his dog, then back at me. "Let me think about it." He walked off slower than usual, but he didn't say no. That night I reviewed the footage from the past week, every drive-by, every subtle violation. Brian had parked partially on my curb 3 times. Janice walked across my lawn once to hand a notice to Doug, each time caught in full resolution. I stitched the clips into a single reel, time-stamped and labeled. No commentary, just facts. Then I opened a blank folder on my desktop and labeled it Board Reckoning. It was time. The next morning, I filed a request through the HOA's outdated online portal for a special community meeting under Clause 3.1. When a quorum of residents raise written concern regarding board behavior or conflict of interest, a public session must be convened within 10 business days. I didn't need signatures, just documentation. The bylaws, their bylaws, said so. At noon, I printed a copy of my filing and delivered it in person, walking it right to Janice's door. She opened it halfway, phone pressed to her ear. "You've got 2 minutes." I handed her the envelope. "Then I'll only need 10 seconds. She opened it, eyes scanning. "You think this is going to scare me?" "No," I said. "I think it's going to reveal you." She closed the door a little too hard for someone who wasn't worried. Back at home, I pulled up the footage again and set my phone to record. "Hey neighbors," I said into the lens. "You're going to want to see what happens next." The video got shared more than I expected. By sunset, 3 different neighbors had texted me, "Saw the footage, that's wild. She walked on your grass," and my favorite, "Doug, of course, I'll bring popcorn to the next meeting." The silent ones were watching too. A few extra waves, a couple of hesitant glances. The wind had started to shift. But I wasn't banking on the crowd. My next move was mechanical, quiet, exact. That night I walked out to the lawn with a tool belt and a low-beam headlamp. Every sensor was carefully adjusted, angled slightly forward now, positioned to trigger only under real pressure. Not wind, not passing cats, just weight. I replaced the temporary PVC tubes with shallow steel sleeves, barely an inch beneath the soil. Inside them went the pressure-kiggered plates I'd built in the school shop a week prior. Each one was rigged to trigger a loud metallic snap. Harmless to people, but loud enough to make someone think twice about what they just did. Were they legally booby traps? No, not even close. I made sure of that. No injury risk, no puncture, just psychological warfare, like a bear trap that barks. I tested one using a 10-pound dumbbell wrapped in cloth. The click was sharp. The dirt snapped back. The light flashed red. That's all I needed. By the next morning, I had 5 set along the lawn's inner edge, well within my boundary, and just where Janice's tires usually kissed the curb. Terry stopped by around 9. He was holding a thermos. No dog this time, just him. "I saw the video," he said. "Didn't know you'd been filming." "I only film what they pretend not to do," I said. He shifted, then glanced toward the pecan tree. "I went through my emails last night. I found the board meeting agenda from that 2019 vote. She never listed the easement change, just called it emergency language update. That's how she pushed it through." "You willing to say that on record?" He hesitated, then handed me a flash drive. "It's all in there. Email headers, timestamps, notes. I exported everything." I didn't say thank you. I just nodded. That was better for him. After he left, I sat under the tree and replayed the motion center footage from the week. Every flash of a car, every step across the boundary. It wasn't just about proving trespass anymore, it was about exposing the pattern. How Janice used small moments to chip away at people's confidence. She didn't need force, just apathy, compliance. But people weren't as compliant anymore. By Wednesday, a formal notice went out to the entire neighborhood. Special HOA meeting called Review of Board Procedures and Resident Concerns. Signed reluctantly, Janice Whitcomb, HOA President. Doug stopped by holding the letter like it was radioactive. You really did it, he said. You dragged her into daylight. I just pointed where she was already standing, I said. He looked out across the lawn at the row of solar lights, now steady and unblinking. You ever think about just moving? He asked, starting fresh somewhere quieter. I smiled. She's the noise, not me. I'm just making sure the neighborhood hears it. Before he left, Doug looked at the pecan tree again. That's been here as long as I can remember. Guess that tree's seen all of this before. It's seen worse, I said, but it never moved either. That night, I sharpened the last of the fake spike plates, not to use, just to store. A reminder. If this all went sideways, I had every document, every email, every video saved in 2 places. One digital, one in a metal lockbox under the floorboards. They could lie, they could twist, but they couldn't unsay what they'd already done. And the closer we got to that meeting, the more I felt it building, like tension in the ground right before it shifts. Not a storm, a shift. The morning of the meeting, everything was quiet. No cars rolling slow past my curb, no passive-aggressive notices tucked under my door. Just the sound of wind rustling through the pecan leaves and the distant hum of someone mowing 3 houses down. Too quiet. At 10:47 IEM, my front motion cam pinged. I pulled the footage live on my phone and caught the silver flash of Janice's Lexus creeping up the street. She slowed right in front of my house. Then, in perfect HOA fashion, she did it again, 2 wheels onto the grass, just enough to technically stay out of the street while still asserting whatever crooked authority she thought she had left. She stepped out in heels, arms full of files and a bright white binder titled Board Materials, Official Version. As she crossed toward Doug's house, the moment came. A sharp click echoed from beneath the lawn. Janice jolted mid-step, her heel slipping slightly on the turf. She spun around, eyes wide, scanning the ground like it had just hissed at her. Another click sounded behind her. Not dangerous, just deliberate. Her eyes landed on the solar lights, then the cameras. She froze, unsure which one to react to first. I watched from the living room, sipping coffee. The camera caught everything. The way she tried to compose herself, brushing her blazer flat, glancing up and down the block like maybe no one saw her flinch. But I did, and so did the camera. When she got back in the car, she reversed out slower than I'd ever seen her drive, like the lawn might bite if she made any sudden moves. By noon, my phone buzzed again, this time from Elias. You ready? He asked. Recordings ready, documents sorted, flash drive labeled. Then it's time to close the trap. The meeting was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. at the community center, neutral ground, but make no mistake, it would be a battlefield. Doug stopped by around 5, holding 2 folding chairs and a 6-pack of iced tea. Thought we might need front row seats, he said. I like the optimism. I like the justice. We arrived early, the room filled fast. Neighbors who'd never so much as waved before were now glancing over at me like I was holding a secret they wanted in on. Janice walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a powder blue suit and a tight-lipped smile like she was about to receive an award. Brian followed, expression stiff, clutching a laptop like it might protect him from facts. Terry came in last, no notes, no folder, just his presence. The room settled, a murmur, then silence. Janice stood at the head table. I'd like to begin tonight's special session with a review of community concerns. As president, I'd like to introduce a motion first, I said, rising from my seat. Janice blinked. Excuse me? I walked to the front. Motion to review the legal standing of the current board's procedural changes, starting with the 2019 easement edits. A ripple moved through the room. Janice's smile thinned. That's outside the scope of. Terry Long, I interrupted, has provided documentation showing that the 2019 vote was misrepresented on the meeting agenda. That's a violation of Clause 4.2 in the original charter. Terry stood without a word and handed me a single printed sheet. I passed it to the front row. I plugged in my flash drive and brought up the video reel. Janice's car, on my lawn, Brian trespassing, her walking across property lines, each clip with a timestamp, followed by the relevant bylaw underneath. No narration, just evidence. When the final clip played, the moment her heel caught on the pressure plate and she flinched like the lawn had snapped back at her, the room broke into a low wave of murmurs. Someone whispered, "That's her trap, not his." But they were wrong. And this wasn't a trap. This was a mirror. And she finally had to look. The silence that followed the last clip wasn't awkward, it was surgical. The kind of stillness that slices right through a lie and leaves only truth exposed. Janice stood at the front of the room, arms crossed over her binder, blinking at the projection screen like it might somehow change. But the final frame, her car on my lawn, time-stamped, paused just as the tire dipped over the curb, stayed frozen in place, a still life of arrogance. "I'd like to respond," she said finally, voice steady but thinner than usual. "You'll have your chance," someone called from the back. I couldn't tell who. Might have been Ms. Lee. Or Gerald from the west, cul-de-sac, the one she fined for hanging laundry on a Sunday. Janice's eyes flicked toward Terry, who still hadn't sat down. He looked calm, centered, and for once she looked unsure. "I understand this may appear out of context," she began, tone shifting to a polished blend of concern and condescension. "But the board operates with collective interest. My actions have always reflected a commitment to community standards." "Did the community vote on the easement change?" Terry asked, his voice clear, carrying. "Because I didn't see it on the 2019 agenda." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. People were sitting straighter now, leaning forward. Janice faltered. "It was labeled as a language clarification, emergency clause." Terry tilted his head. "And why was that emergency not disclosed?" "I didn't think it required elaboration." That was her first real mistake, admitting it out loud. Elias, seated in the front row, leaned forward. "According to HOA Charter Section 2.3, any vote that alters resident property rights requires full community notification and written consent, not an internal rewording, not an emergency clause." She didn't respond. She couldn't. "I move for a formal audit of all procedural votes made under Janice Whitcomb's tenure as president," someone said. This time, definitely Gerald. "I second that," came another voice. And like dominoes, hands went up. Residents who'd been quiet for years, suddenly ready to reclaim their space. Janice's hand clenched around the white binder. "You're letting a few edited videos dictate the narrative," she said sharply. "This is a coordinated smear campaign." I stood again. Not to argue, but to speak directly to the room. "For months," I said, "my property has been walked on, parked over, and cited for violations that don't exist. I didn't ask for this fight. I tried private discussions, filings, everything, but this board weaponized silence, and I refused to be quiet about it. I let the weight settle. No theatrics, just fact. This isn't about one lawn. It's about a pattern, a system, and all I did was point a camera at it." Janice scoffed, but no one laughed with her. Instead, Doug stood up near the back. "You fined me for wind chimes," he said. "Said they were auditory pollution. I let it go, figured it wasn't worth the fight. But now? Yeah, it was never about the chimes." Another voice, "She threatened me with legal action for trimming my tree too low." Someone else, "She told me if I painted my door without approval, I could be removed." And just like that, the room cracked open. All the quiet compliance she'd built her rule on was gone, replaced by voices, statements, memories too sharp to stay buried. Janice backed toward her seat, binder still clutched tight, but the binder couldn't shield her now. The weight of years pressed in. She wasn't in control of the room anymore. She was surrounded by it. The chairperson, an older gentleman named Paul, who rarely said anything beyond "meeting adjourned," finally stood. "I believe we've heard enough to warrant a formal vote. Tonight." No one disagreed. Janice looked at me then. No smugness, just tight-lipped calculation, like she was mentally running through exits that. And I just looked back. Not angry, not smug, Just ready. Because the ground she walked on? It finally pushed back. Paul cleared his throat like he hadn't spoken to a room in 10 years. The silence that followed wasn't about tension. It was permission. Everyone was ready. "We'll conduct the vote by a show of hands," he said, his voice steady but deliberate. "Motion on the table is to suspend Janice Whitcomb's authority as HOA president pending formal review of misconduct and procedural violations." Janice's expression didn't change. She sat, stone still at the table, fingers pressed tightly against her binder. But the color had drained from her face. "Those in favor?" Paul asked, raising his hand. 1. And 2. Them 10. Hands lifted in rows like waves. Even Brian, her own board ally, hesitated, then lifted his hand halfway. Not loyalty, just self-preservation. Terry's hand went up last, calm and unwavering. Janice stood. "This is a farce," she snapped. "A coordinated smear with no legal grounds. You can't just—" "You push through a rule change without disclosure," Paul cut in, firm now. "That alone violates charter code. You've used that position to intimidate, fine, and silence. You may call it leadership. Most of us call it abuse." The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. It just agreed. She looked across the room, desperate to find even one sympathetic face, but the tide had rolled out and she was standing alone in wet sand. "I won't resign," she said finally. "You can't make me resign." "No one said you had to," I said from my seat. "But you won't be calling the next meeting." Paul nodded. "Effective immediately, Janice Whitcomb is suspended. The board will convene within 72 hours to determine interim leadership and begin the audit." That was it. No explosion, no outburst, just quiet authority, justice without theatrics. Janice gathered her things without a word, binder now clutched like a deflated shield. As she walked past me, her eyes darted toward the projector, where the still frame of her Lexus on my lawn remained frozen in place. She didn't meet my gaze. She didn't have to. Her silence told the truth louder than her protests ever did. When the room began to thin, people approached me, not as a hero, but as a neighbor. "Thank you, Cold. I didn't know how to speak up until you did." "You made the rest of us brave." I didn't say much in return, just nodded, offered a few quiet words, shook hands. My fight had never been about winning applause. It was about restoring boundaries, the kind you don't see until someone crosses them. Doug slapped me on the back on the way out. "You ever think about running for the board yourself?" I smirked. "I've already got a job." He pointed toward the pecan tree. "Then make sure that thing runs again next year. You planted something out here. Might not be grass, but it grew." The projector clicked off, the lights came up, and just like that, the room returned to what it had always been. Plain walls, plastic chairs, and a community figuring out how to heal. I stepped outside into the cool night. The moonlight spilled across the lawn, catching the brass plaque under the pecan tree, the words still clear. Boundary kept, legacy honored. It hadn't changed. But we had. Behind me the doors closed, and I knew Janice would be drafting one last email tonight. Not to argue, not to defend, nothing to explain. And the beauty was, no one needed her explanation anymore. We had the truth. We had the vote. And we had our neighborhood back. 2 weeks passed before the board met again. Janice was gone by then. Sold her house, moved to a condo across town where someone else could deal with her folders and fines. Her departure wasn't loud. Just a moving van, a silent Sunday, and an empty driveway by Monday. The board appointed Terry as interim president. He didn't want the job, he made that clear from day one, but he was the only one the neighborhood trusted to hold the seat until elections. I kept my distance. I wasn't looking to lead a revolution, I just wanted the space to breathe. Still, it was different now. Neighbors waved more, some stopped to chat, even Gerald brought me banana bread with a note that just said, "For your patience." Doug came by with 2 lawn chairs and said, "We earned a sit down." So we sat. Right under the pecan tree, the grass had started to recover. Funny how something can be trampled, rutted, scraped bare, and still grow back, like it was waiting for permission. "Think she knew you were recording from the beginning?" Doug asked. Probably not, I said, but I think she always knew she was wrong, that's why she pushed harder. He nodded, then sipped from his thermos. And the spike plates? Still there, disabled, just reminders now. He grinned, like landmines of justice. The wind moved through the branches above us, dropping a few pecan shells to the dirt. Do you ever feel like your granddad planned all this for you? Doug asked after a while. I looked down at the brass plaque, then up at the sky beyond the leaves. No, I think he just knew the world doesn't change. You do. The rules, the people breaking them, they come in waves, but a man with a map, a spine, and a shovel, that's a constant. Doug leaned back. Well, I'm glad you didn't move. Feels like the whole block exhaled. I didn't respond right away, just took in the sight of the lawn, the clean lines, the solar lights still holding their post, and the old metal boundary stakes now flush with the ground but firmly in place. And there, in the center, under the tree where the ashes of a man who believed in doing things the right way still rested, I felt the story settle. Not end, just settle. Later that evening, I walked the perimeter of the lawn one last time, not out of fear, not to check for trespassers, but just to feel it. To feel the earth that had been mine all along, but now no one else dared claim. At the edge, I stopped and looked back. This wasn't just about a lawn anymore. It was about every time someone thinks they can take a little from you because they're louder, or they have a title, or they count on you being too tired to fight. But some lines aren't just drawn. Some are built, and when the ground remembers what it was made for, it pushes back. Sometimes you don't need to shout, you just need to stand. That's what my grandfather used to say. Turns out, he was right. Have you ever had to stand your ground against an unfair HOA or fight back in a way that surprised even you? I'd love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. Because the truth is, no one fights these battles alone. And when one of us draws a line, it helps others remember they can too.